Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we look at the dynamics that infect our relationships, not just our relationship with other people, which is how we naturally think about it, but also our relationship with ourself and our relationship with God. So we name those dynamics and we give you tools to manage them so that you can improve your well-being with God, your faith, and even your human relationships. And today I'm really excited. I've got Ian Cron on the show. I think Ian is probably very well known to most of us. He's probably most famous for his Enneagram work, his best-selling book, The Road Back to You. But there's so much more to Ian than just that one facet. I was first introduced to his work when I was a lead pastor and feeling a bit isolated and alone. And Ian wrote a fictional memoir. I mean, it really was a fiction, but it was loosely based, I think, on his own journey, called Chasing Francis. And it was the story of a pastor digging into the life of St. Francis. And man, that book just hit me at the right time. So I became an Ian Cron fan before it was cool to be an Ian Cron fan, I guess I would say it that way. But I've always known that there's more to him than simply Enneagram. He's a priest, he's a therapist. And his most recent book, The Fix, is about 12-step processes. And it's really helpful. The book's called The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. Fantastic book. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Ian. He's just such a great conversationalist, but also so much wisdom in that guy. So before we get to that conversation, we're going to pause and just light our candle, and then we'll go right from the candle into the conversation. If you're newer to the show, we light a candle every week, whether you join us on audio or video, just to intentionally pause and relax into God's presence. That's the goal, because these dynamics that infect our relationships can often infect our capacity to notice God. And so the candle just helps us notice God and remember that God's with us. So let's light that now. All right, here's my conversation with Ian. Ian, you talk about your family of origin. You said that alcoholism doesn't run in my family, it gallops through it. Tell us about that.
Well, that's a good lead question. Yeah, man. I as a friend of mine, I have a dear friend, her name is Ashley Cleveland, and Ashley likes to say that she hails from an alcoholic dynasty. And I share that. I share that in common with her. My dad was an alcoholic and prescription drug addict. I have a sibling who's in recovery. My father's two sisters died of alcoholism. I have a son, and I'm free to say this. I have his permission. I have a son who is in recovery. So, I mean, it's just like a waterfall of people looking for external solutions to internal problems in my family. And, as you know, addictions are incredibly complicated, right? And as to their genesis and all that stuff. But yeah, man, it's just part of my story. There were a lot of alcoholics and addicts in my family.
Yeah. And so by the time you're 8 years old, you're already sneaking a little bit of whiskey. But you're also reading Tolstoy. Like, you were kind of a deep kid.
Yeah, I was a sensitive, artistic, Enneagram 4 kid. I mean, I just was a kid that was seeing the world from different angles. I was very small for my age, so not very involved in athletics, very drawn to songwriting, anything creative, and the out of doors, experiencing God and nature. I just was also just very attuned to the spiritual in the world around me. And it made me an interesting kid. I think it made me a decent enough writer, but it also made me the object of a lot of bullying because I was a little bit of an odd duck.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you talk about you became a Christian when you were a junior in high school. As many wonderful testimonies, some girl invited you to some Christian event, a great motivation for your average dude. But the way you write about it, Ian, you said, I became a Christian and that massively complicated your life because now you were two people.
Yes. And I would, just by way of editing that just a little bit, I would say I became a Christian as a little boy in the Catholic Church. I was very taken by the Mass, by this teaching in the Catholic tradition that, God's presence is teeming is all around us. God's grace is teeming all around us. And so when I got to high school and I was involved in Young Life, what they gave me was a different vocabulary of faith that rounded out my experience as a young Catholic kid. And what I mean by two people, in high school, by the time I got to high school, I was a decent, I had decent grades. I was pretty popular. It was a big high school of 3,000 kids. I was already a person who had a reputation for being quite a partier. I mean, I think my Young Life campaigners, Bible study group was like, sort of treated me as like their trophy, like, oh, we got this one. And I just was now living two lives, right? I had this life that was genuinely, earnestly, sincerely wanting to follow God, wanting to align my life with the values of the kingdom. And there was this other part of me that just loved popularity, partying, approval, mood altering substances, and high risk behavior, and being, a man about town. So, we could actually have an internal family systems conversation here, but I definitely had these two parts, right? One part was this very spiritual guy. Another part was, you know, um, my more Saint Augustine lust for life part.
Yeah. It's fascinating how we don't realize when we're young that our spiritual part or our religious part can sometimes be as equally a coping mechanism. One of my favorite authors is Thomas Keating, the
Oh
old
yeah.
Catholic monk. And
Hmm.
he's so funny when he talks about this old alcoholic that later in life came into the monastery to become a monk. And his testimony as he came into the monastery recently sober was that he used to be able to drink anybody under the table. And then Keating kind of observed him for a year and then said, well, congratulations, you're not drinking, but now you can fast anyone under the table.
Well, if you're, we have a joke among my friends in the rooms of recovery that if somebody invented a pill that would cure alcoholism, we'd take 10 of them.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things I think is a real superpower, Ian, is your recent stint back in rehab.
Yeah.
So you talked about as a teenager becoming two people, but you wrote The Road Back to You. That book blew up. It really introduced hundreds of thousands of people to your work. You then became a public figure, and then you start to fall off the wagon. That has to be an incredibly terrifying experience to now be a public figure and be navigating that. Or what was that like?
Well, this all happened in 2020. And, here's the thing about addiction, Steve. It's the one disease that'll tell you don't have a disease. And so sometimes by the time you figure out that there's a problem, it's, you're kind of in over your head, right? Um, and so, I mean, again, I find myself in this life of two people, right? Like, and the amount of emotional and cognitive dissonance that goes along with that is pretty intense. Um, but thankfully, it didn't last that long, and thankfully, I had people around me who were incredibly supportive and understanding and empathic, and I was willing to move aggressively to, get this not under control per se, but to get this, treated and back into the place it needed to be. So, here's the thing about a relapse, right? Or about addictions in general. You know, I really feel like addictions can be viewed as invitations from God to a kind of intimacy with Him that we didn't know previously existed. And they're kind of a soul summons My friend Dan Allender, and Dan.
Yeah.
Dan often talks about the magic of addictions. And I remember the first time I heard him say that, and he says provocative stuff like that all the
Yeah.
time, right? But he just talked about the magic of addictions, and something in me really clicked. Because despite the fact that yes, it's serious, we want to get these things addressed, right? But at the same time, through a spiritual lens, they can really be understood as almost as if God is saying to us, there is something more, and it's not this. And it's not even what you had previously. There's something even more. And let this be an invitation to you to go and find out what that is.
You mentioned going to a meeting and one of the speakers at the meeting saying that while we're in this basement, your addiction is out in the parking lot doing push-ups and getting stronger. I thought that was such a helpful, threatening and invitational idea.
Yeah, I mean, so listen, I first got sober in 1987, right? And I spent many decades without relying on any substances of any kind. And what I underestimated was the fact that addictions may go to sleep, but they don't go away, right? And you just have to keep one eye on them. Once the brain has become habituated to something at some point, once it gets reactivated, it not only wants to pick up, it doesn't even want to pick up where it left off. It wants to pick up even further down the road than where you left off, right? Mm. And that may be true. And listen, that's not just true of substances. That's true of addictions to workaholism, porn, gaming, sports betting, sex, addictions, codependency. I mean, I just think addictions are always self-escalating, and eventually, they're always in the background and gaining strength, and so you have to make sure that you have a program of recovery that is equal to the task of keeping that part of you taken care of, loved, in fact, and taken care of.
Yeah, I love that you said loved. In my work, people come and do 5-day intensives with us, and one of the things we're encouraging them to do is lower their pretense and step out of their protection and just be human-sized. Where their heart is open, they've got nothing to lose, nothing to prove, nothing is a threat, and we call it being home. When you are home, you can relax. You can do difficult things, but you're not on guard. Your coping mechanisms are lowered. In the book, you beautifully connect home and salvation. I'd love to hear for my audience to hear some from you on that. I just thought that was so moving.
Yeah, well, when I was in treatment, I had this woman. She was doing EMDR, and she was this woman who was just, I mean, really, she was. I laugh and say, "Did you go to Burning Man?" I mean, she just was like kind of hippie-esque, and just sort of right. But she was like 70 and long, flowing gray hair. Anyway, I think in the book I say it looks like she made her clothes on a loom. She did, and yet, do you know when you meet somebody who just is splashing genuine empathy in every direction? And you
can't get enough of it.
You can't get enough of it. And she said, "Tell me your story." And I did. And, it was early in my stay there, and I was just a kind of a mess. And she's like, she looked at me and she said, "I think you've endured enough already, don't you?" And I was like, it was like such a weird, obvious question, but coming from her, I just, lost it. Right. It was so beautiful. And everything in me said, yeah, I think I have, and then later in that conversation, she referenced a story in the big books of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the story, a woman says that in the Hebrew scriptures, one translation of the word salvation means to come home. And I think what you described and what I think part of the journey of faith is, what does it mean to come home to ourselves? To come home to who we are. I'm always struggling with the language of authentic self, true self, all that stuff, because in some ways I think it's a bit of a ruse sometimes, but to come home to one's own heart and to God, I think is a very real thing. And I think I think I think salvation as coming home is at the very least a poetic and rich metaphor for understanding the journey of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine was unjustly fired from a high role in a big church, and she'd poured years into there, and her male lead pastor was kind of threatened by her shepherding. A lot of the church really loved her work. She'd put, I think, 7 years in there, and
Yeah.
he fired her, and man, she just got angry and depressed, and cut off from her care. And her husband, they'd been married decades. Her husband gently approached her and said, "Look, you're treating everybody who loves you like a threat. Like, would you
Mm-hmm.
please go get help? Because
Mm.
I love you, but you're treating me like I'm your enemy." And she went to this counselor, and she was all, armored up, and this counselor's trying to disarm her. And he asked her, "Where is home for you?" And of course, by which he meant, where can your soul just relax and you not have to be armored up? And she was embarrassed because her answer was quite indulgent. It was like a beach vacation with massages and good food and no one else around, just a book. And so he said to her, "Don't come back until you've done your homework." And it took a couple of months for her to get it all sorted out. And she walked back in, and he just, from her countenance, he said, "I see you've been home." I find that so moving. Could you give us, for our audience, where is home for you, or who is home for you? What are some examples of that in your life?
I love this question. I think I have so many homes. I have like a series of hostels in the mountains, like I could go from one to the next. Wow. Um, so I would say home for me is um, certainly near the ocean where I grew up. It's in the Cotswolds in England. Wandering. I'm very at home out of doors. I'm very connected out of doors. Um, in terms of relationships, it's interesting. I've been married almost 40 years, so you have a lot of seasons of marriage. But I'd say that relationship is a place of home right now. Um, and I would say my 12-step community is a kind of home, you know,
Yeah,
as kooky and wild as it can be.
yeah,
And always and always and always music has been a home.
yeah. Yeah, what do you play, Ian? I know you're a songwriter. What's your instrument or instruments of choice?
Mostly guitar and singing, but my thing was lyrics and some melody stuff. And I still, I did a co-write last week with friends, and so I still here in Nashville, I'm out writing with people from time to time. But just I can sit and listen to certain symphonies or certain pieces of music, and just something so transcendent and so I just whew, I mean, my experience of God in those moments is so rich and real that it does feel like a kind of like I've returned to that far off country and I'm home again, you know?
Yeah, yeah. A couple of things just generally about the fix. I mean, people should read you just because of your gift of writing. Like, there are just certain people that write so well that you want to read
Mm,
them. But also, Ian, I think the way you help all of us see the benefit of 12 step, whether we see ourselves with a traditional addiction or not, I think really you're offering us a path to freedom. Some people might
mm,
call it discipleship, but
mhm.
um, I love in one of the steps when it comes to higher power, there are recovery groups that don't allow you to name your higher power. The higher power is Jesus. And I understand what those groups are doing, but I've always appreciated traditional AA because you get to choose your higher power. You write about how one guy chose a vending machine, a Coke machine. But you have a warning for Christians that I think is really beneficial. Most of my audience are followers of Jesus, where you say, don't be so fast at naming Jesus your higher power. Why is that? What's the benefit of going slow there?
Because oftentimes, many of us, particularly those people who have grown up in the church, have inherited scripts about who Jesus is that may not be entirely accurate and may need updating. And I don't think we should be anxious about that. I don't think we need to be. I think one of these hip new words, not new particularly, but certainly is in fashion, is deconstruction. And on one level, I raise one eyebrow at it, because often when I talk to people who claim to be in a process of deconstructing their faith, there's no plan for reconstruction.
Yeah, right.
And so what they actually do is get caught in some side eddy in the river where they just swim around in cynicism and disappointment with people in the past and church and all that stuff. And I'm like, okay, you can have your little season there, but we need to move on and to something better. But I think there's a kind of healthy deconstruction that we all have to do. And we will do it just instinctively by getting older, right? Like the older we get, our theologies change, they soften, they grow, they become more spacious. Our understanding of who Jesus is changes, and it needs to change. I mean, my gosh, if my theology and view of Jesus at 60 is the same as it was when I was a young life kid at 16, I've got problems, right? That's not good.
Yeah.
Right? Relationships need to change. And so oftentimes in the rooms of recovery, especially with Christians, I'm like, okay, well, let's just not just go rushing to our old conceptions of who Jesus is. What if we actually were to go and just say, Jesus, I actually need to do something of a rewrite here, and open myself up to the possibility of you reintroducing yourself to me in a way that is more accurate and true to who you actually are, versus the Jesus I picked up or was handed as a smaller person. So it's a little bit like spiritual differentiation, right? It's like, time to move on. I now have to have the Jesus of my own understanding, but that means I have to start maybe with a blank slate and go from there.
I'd love to get your reaction to something. I several years ago discovered a Catholic priest named Herbert McCabe.
Oh, yeah.
And he's not very well known. And okay, so you're familiar with him.
Yes.
It just provoked me so much, Ian, his idea that sin, we often, when we say the word sin, we put all this kind of moral value on sin.
Yes.
And McCabe says, it's really an infection. And what it does is it infects your view of God's view of you.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change God's view of you. It does something much worse. It changes your opinion or your view of God's view of you. And he uses the prodigal son, where he shows that the father never changes, but both brothers see the father differently because they're so-called in sin. We've been exploring that over this podcast. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's beautiful. I do. I think it's beautiful. And I say in the fix, I sort of explore the idea of sin just very, very briefly, right? I tend to see sin more as an inherited, like almost a disease model, right? Like, frankly, Steve, I can tell you, I have a potpourri of sins in my life that I would empty my bank account to get over. You know what I mean? And I've tried everything on my own unaided willpower to get over them, right? I did not sign up for them. I was not consulted about which sins would be particularly attractive to me, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So I actually see sin more the way that you might see diabetes or asthma, right? It's an inherited condition. And because of that, what rises in me is a kind of empathy and understanding about my relationship with patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving, being in the world that I know are contrary or in opposition to the gospel of grace and love. I'm very clear-eyed about sin and about how devastating and awful it can be. I've been so influenced by Merton in my life. Thomas Merton has had probably more influence on me than any other writer in the Christian tradition. And what Merton would say, and this is maybe what I believe, that within each of us, there is a kind of hidden wholeness, what he called, he referred to it as the diamond, at our core, which is this part of us that has not been tainted by sin, nor has it ever been damaged by trauma, nor, it is this splinter of God in us, this splinter of goodness at our core.
Yeah.
The problem is that, we lose touch with that core. And when we do, the further away from that core we get, the more the disease of sin becomes apparent and manifest in our lives.
Does your theology begin at Genesis 1 or Genesis 3? I think how you see
Yes.
that is profound. And, is Paul saying that God punishes us when we sin, or is Paul saying that sin punishes us when we sin? And God is warning us, like any good parent would, to be so careful not to dabble in this thing that'll consume you.
Yeah, I don't know, Steve. It seems to me that the universe has unspoken, unseen laws. You
Yeah.
you can get away with certain things for just so long before the universe. You can bend the laws of the universe pretty far, pretty far, but eventually they will snap back.
Yeah.
Like a stick when you're walking through the woods on a tree and smack
Yeah.
you right in the face. Right.
Yeah.
I think sin, ultimately it's our sin that punishes us, right? It's like a universal law, right? If you lie, you're going to pay a price for this down the road. It will be
Yeah.
found out. You will. And God doesn't actually have to do anything. It's the way the universe is set up, right?
Yeah.
And you will eventually pay the price for your own misadventures,
Yeah. Well, and that just circles us back to the fix. Another quote you have in there that really stood me in my tracks because it was just so stark. Somebody has to die if you're going to be well.
Yes. And that somebody has to be you. So, I mean, look, this is a teaching right out of the 12 steps, right? Like the egoic self has to go, right? Now, and I think I used Pinocchio as an example
You do, yeah.
of a story that I've always actually wanted to write a book about Pinocchio as the ultimate spiritual journey, right? Someone who's born in the world with this desire to become a real boy, real girl, if you want to, become gender inclusive. But I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what we all want when we get here, And but of course, his story is filled with misadventures, right? The whole first half of his story is Pleasure Island, and for those who remember the Disney version, and Stromboli's Circus, where he becomes a celebrity, and all this stuff. But eventually, there's this beautiful point in the story where Pinocchio dies saving his woodmaking carver, Geppetto. And that's when he's brought back to life. And that's when he dies, remember when the blue fairy, gosh, I'm really going all over the map today, but the blue fairy says to him, because of what you've done, essentially died to yourself. Now you're deserving of becoming a real boy. And in that moment, he goes from being an animated puppet to a real boy. Now, I just think that's one of the most amazing gospel presentations I've ever heard. Now,
Yeah.
when Paul says, "For I no longer live, but Christ lives in me," the I he uses there is ego, right? In Greek, ego, literally, right? So for I, the ego, no longer lives, but Christ lives in me. The life I, well, who's that I? If that previous I is dead, who's this new I? It's somebody else altogether, right? It's no longer the egoic self, but the essential self, if you will, right? And so actually when Paul says, you're going to have to, yourself is going to have to be crucified, it's awesome news. It's great news. It's that really pesky egoic self that is going to get killed. Your true self is going to come to the fore and is going to be just beautifully lived and experienced.
Yeah. I'm loving this conversation. One of the things we've been focusing on in this season is the coping mechanisms that don't work. And my favorite is known as the attempted solution. It was coined by a therapist named Jay Haley. People would come in to see him at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto. And they said, here's my problem. And Jay would say, oh, I don't treat problems. I only treat your attempted solutions to problems.
Yes.
And then, of course, the evidence of any attempted solution is more of the same or try harder. That's what he was always looking for. What does that provoke in you?
So much, Steve.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I mean, look, let's talk about addictions for a second, because I actually would love to, if I could just somehow or another in the Christian community normalize conversations around addiction. I mean, look, this is a teaching that goes back thousands of years. I mean, the early church mothers and fathers would have spoken about addictions as attachments, right?
Attachments,
Addiction
right?
is a later term.
Yeah.
I just wish there was more teaching on this, right? Because we live in this is a fact, we live in the most addicted cohort in history.
Yeah.
Right. And addictions, no matter how mild they are or severe they are, all diminish our relationship with God, with ourselves, and with others. They are the source of terrible suffering. Right. And to be clear, when we talk about addictions, we're not just talking about alcohol and drugs. I mean, addictions can take countless forms. And as you know, in the fix, I have a long list of just a sample of addictions. But, let's talk about technology. Let's talk about social media. Let's talk about approval. Let's talk about codependency. Everyone I know is probably codependent. People who are addicted in relationships or to eating or dieting or self-help or shopping, spending, whatever the case may be. Addictions take lots of different forms, right? Now, to your question, I often hear people say, oh, well, Steve has a drinking problem, or Steve has a spending problem, or Steve has a porn problem, right? I say, no, that's not actually true. Steve has a drinking solution. Steve has a porn solution. Steve has a spending solution. And when you say it that way, I'm telling you, every time I say that when I'm at a speaking event, the lights go on in the room and people go, oh, now I get it. And I'm like, and then what comes up is a compassion and empathy for the person who is suffering from their, ill-conceived solutions. But
Yeah.
the drinking isn't the problem. Drugs isn't the problem. They're the solutions to the problem. Now, the problem, we can talk about what that is at some other point, but the key is you have to turn your attention toward the problem while, at the same time getting someone to stop the behavior, right? Particularly if it's, potentially fatal. And the problem is principally spiritual, right? It is psychological. It is biological and physical. I mean, like I said, addictions are complicated, but its principal treatment is spiritual in my mind. And, I just always want people to understand that in the mind of somebody who is an addict, this is not the problem. It's their solution to the problem. And when they realize that, there's an aha moment where it's like, oh, I have to go look at the problem. And then maybe the solution will be rendered unnecessary in the process.
The deeper work with attempted solutions is learning to notice the predictable pattern of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something weird in that when you're in it, when you are madly trying to solve your problem, you become somehow blind that you're in a stuck pattern.
Yes.
What's your best advice to someone to figure out if they're in a stuck pattern that isn't working?
Try just stopping. If you can't stop, chances are you're stuck in a pattern, right? Like this is just old advice that you often hear in the rooms of recovery. If someone comes in and goes, I'm not sure if I'm an alcoholic will say, go back out and drink. They don't say, oh, no one tries to convince anybody of anything in those rooms. It's like, I'll tell you what, just go back out and drink. And if you can stop after one, well, you're okay, great.
Yeah,
if you can't, we'll see you tomorrow. It's like, because, you have to give people the right and the dignity of making their own choices and going on their own journeys, right? So, I guess for me, another way of determining if you have a pattern that is stuck, like particularly with addictions, if you constantly find yourself having to put guardrails around things, like, oh, I'm getting this blocker on my computer and I'm having accountability partners and this thing and the next thing, and you're not stopping, you know what I mean? Like all those things are good. I'm not saying those things are bad as support tools, but if you're having to do that and not winning in the equation, then chances are something's gone sideways.
Ian Cron, I know that you have approached this interview with some level of fear and trembling. I can feel it through the screen, knowing that we would eventually get to the gauntlet of anxiety questions on being human. You've written phenomenal fiction about the life of St. Francis and the life of a restless pastor chasing Francis. You have played Bandicamp with Andy Gullahorn,
Yes.
the king of all games. You
Master
have
of
been
Master of Cornhole.
and master of cornhole and badminton
Yes.
and bowling. You have been confronted by an unhealthy Enneagram 8 and lived to tell the tale. However, you have not yet endured the rapid fire gauntlet. So we have 4 or 5 questions here. I'll just go one at a time. We do short answer. Here's the first one. What's one way that you treat others that if you started treating yourself the same way, your life would be better?
Mm. Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is I think I'm a genuinely empathic person. If you come to me, Steve, you could say, Ian, I'm coming to Nashville. I want to have a conversation. And you came and you just told me, the deepest, darkest stuff of your life. You could count on me not having 1 ounce of judgment. I mean, I'm really good with empathy. Even my wife is like, yeah, you're good with empathy. I can just sit and listen and be, oh, of course, that's what humans do. Like I'm just empathic. If I could do that more with myself, then I would be a better person for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, empathy.
Okay. Second question, where do you experience a gap between what you believe about God versus what you experience from God?
Mm. Wow. Well, I have as you could probably tell from our conversation, I have a very robust theology of grace, right? Like grace to me is kind of everything, right? Like I just don't believe that human beings can do very much to change themselves. Um, I'm a real big believer that that so much of the spiritual journey is about giving God consent to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, right? Namely, to disentangle us from the bondage of self, right? And the problem is that um, I have a robust theology of grace in which I believe, but it does not always translate to a felt experience of trust in my own body. And so I can, tout all day long about my beliefs, which is merely my intellectual assent to a set of theoretical or theological, you know, propositions. But when it comes to a felt, lived experience of grace, and as it is maybe expressed through trust, that's hard. And I could go back into my history and show you all the trauma that's probably responsible for making that transition, um, you know, at least, makes it difficult for me. Um, I just didn't. I just personally didn't grow up in a place where there were trusted or trustworthy adults, right? And so I just had to figure out how to do life on my own. And so, so though I believe in grace, I don't often have enough of this. I'll use that phrase, a felt experience of it, like in
Yeah.
my body.
Yeah.
That sort of sense of. Now I do periodically have it.
Mhm.
Okay, so I have these beautiful moments where it's like, oh, that's what that feels like. But often anxiety is in the background, preventing that, creating too much noise for me to really experience it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, it brings to mind Jacob. He's like, surely the Lord was in this place and I was not aware of
Oh
it.
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Third question. When the local church is at its best, what's something that it offers that you can't get anywhere else?
Okay, I have an answer to this one off the top of my head because I've actually thought about this many times standing on an altar at my Episcopal church where I volunteer as a priest, right? Um, a couple of things and also because I run into people all the time. It's like, oh, I stopped going to church. I'm still a
Right.
believer. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But let me just tell you couple of things you're missing. Okay. Um, one thing is the assurance of pardon and forgiveness. I remember a friend of mine went to see a therapist one time, and this guy wasn't a Christian, and he went to see this therapist, but he was sort of investigating faith. And this therapist said to him, well, you just need to forgive yourself. And this friend of mine, who's very intellectual and very thoughtful, looked at the therapist, and said, on whose authority?
Mm.
Yours? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
on what authority do you have to tell me that I can and should forgive myself?
Yeah.
And so when you come to church and you hear in my tradition, right, the priest will say, Almighty God, forgive you all your sins through our Lord Jesus Christ, sustain you in all goodness, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, keep you in eternal life. I'd go to church once a week just to hear that. You know what I mean? Just that
Yeah.
you are forgiven. And it's spoken with authority, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is, where else do you go and kneel? Where else in your life, unless, of course, you're in the habit of praying on your knees? The vast majority of people are not. If you're like me, you have trouble getting up if you do. And so, I'm always like, there's something about the posture of worship, of kneeling, when you come up to receive the Eucharist, that is so powerful. And you don't do that. You don't kneel to anything anywhere else during the week, right? At least physically, like publicly announcing through your physical posture that you are kneeling before an authority greater than you, right? And then finally, I'd say is the Eucharist. You just can't. If I just tell people all the time, it's like, dude, okay, well, where are you celebrating with the gathered community? The breaking of the bread. I mean, my favorite text in the scripture is the Emmaus story. And it is in part because, again, I'm kind of Anglo-Catholic, right? So, but that idea that he's repeatedly telling them the story out of scripture and they still don't recognize him. So you can read the Bible all you want, okay? And there's a high likelihood that you still won't recognize Jesus. But the moment he breaks the bread, their eyes are opened and they go, it's you. Now that to me is, yeah.
Weren't our hearts burning? Like, what a
Yes.
statement. Weren't our hearts
Yes.
burning? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And so to me, man, if you just stay home and read the Bible, it's not enough. You need to go the Eucharistic life. It does something to us that's really, really important.
I've asked over 100 guests this question. Yours is my favorite answer. What an amazing answer. I love it. You gave the best answer to that question.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. When in your life most recently, just lately, have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Oh. Mm. Oh man. I have these two buddies, Pete and Mike, and I've known them for almost 40 years. They're both therapists, and we were on a weekend, and we were all leading small, like 6 hours of group therapy a day with guys who are mostly sex and porn addicts, but there was a drug addict in the room. There was also an alcoholic in the room in various levels of sobriety. And the only reason I go on these weekends is I do love to help. I love doing group therapy, all that stuff, but it's really the downtime with Pete and Mike, right? And rarely do I ever feel more seen, known, and loved than when I'm with those two guys, where I feel genuinely myself, and where I feel buoyed by their encouragement and their irreverence and their fun and the fact that they've known me for so long. Um, and then I'd say on a daily basis, my wife and I have a relationship built on lots of years together. And there's a kind of peaceableness in our relationship. It's like we've memorized a kind of beautiful dance with each other. And I would say that is kind of a floor that I can step on with, surety that it's not going to give. And I think in recent years, the last 4 or 5 years, that's become even more apparent and valuable to me.
My guest is Ian Cron. He's probably most famously known for his Enneagram work and his bestseller, The Road Back to You. But those of us who have followed Ian for a long time are not surprised that his latest book, may be his best contribution, The Fix, how the 12 steps offer a surprising path of transformation for the well-adjusted, the down and out, and everyone in between. Ian, this was delightful. Thanks so much for coming on Being Human.
Thanks, Steve. I really enjoyed it.